The single father pushed open the door of the abandoned house and froze when he saw a woman, her body covered in bruises, breaking a piece of moldy bread for a little girl who was sobbing uncontrollably. He said just one sentence, "Pack up your things and come with me." Then he took them away from there. He had no idea that this split-second decision would change the fate of all three of them. Daniel Carter, 38 years old, was a single father and a former soldier who had spent many years stationed along the border. On the day his wife passed away, he had been on duty far up north. While he was away, the woman he loved most was worn down, bit by bit, by her own mother's constant criticism, suspicion, and suffocating control over every breath she took. No one had been there to pull her back from the edge. When Daniel returned, his wife was gone, leaving behind their daughter, Emily, whose eyes carried both her mother's light and her mother's sorrow. That morning, after a simple breakfast, Emily stood by the door, clutching her school bag. "Dad, are you leaving early again?" "Yeah, be good at school today, okay?" She nodded gently, then asked in a small voice, as if afraid the words might hurt the man in front of her, "Dad, do you miss Mom?" Daniel stayed silent for a moment, his gaze resting on the family photo hanging on the wall. His fingertips brushed lightly over his wife's face in the picture. Then he turned to Emily and gave a slight nod. He didn't need to say more, Emily understood. After dropping her off at school, instead of taking the usual road home, Daniel decided to cut through a side path to get back quicker. It was a quiet route, with only the wind moving through the leaves and the crunch of stones under his horse's hooves. In that stillness, he heard a strange sound, a hoarse, dry cough, followed by the broken sobs of a child. He pulled the reins tight and listened. The sound came from the direction of Old Willow Cabin, an abandoned house that had stood empty for many years. Daniel dismounted and walked toward it. The old wooden door was ajar, the hinges creaking softly. A damp, musty smell mixed with something sour hit him straight in the face. Inside the bare room, a woman sat on the cold floor. Her shirt was wrinkled, the skin on her wrists mottled with dark bruises. Her long hair was tied back neatly, but her face was drawn with exhaustion. In her hands was a small knife, slowly slicing pieces from a loaf of bread mottled green with mold, hard as stone, placing them into the hands of a little girl of about 7 who was pressed close beside her. The girl was thin, clutching a worn cloth doll. When she received the piece of bread, she didn't eat it right away but looked up at her mother, tears welling in her eyes, and said, "Mom, I don't want to eat this." The woman gently brushed her daughter's hair, her voice trembling. "Eat it, sweetheart. We don't have anything else left to eat." The little girl clutched the piece of bread tightly, tears welling up and sliding down her thin cheeks. Her face was gaunt, her eyes red and swollen. When the bread touched her lips, she shivered, then buried her face into her mother's shoulder with a small sob. Daniel Carter stood there for a few seconds, watching. Without a greeting, without a question, he simply stepped all the way inside, his shadow falling across the worn floor. Both mother and daughter looked up. The mother didn't appear frightened or surprised, only with the gaze of someone long accustomed to enduring. Daniel spoke, his voice firm but not raised. "Pack your things and come with me. Today." The woman blinked, her lips moving but no sound coming out. She tightened her grip on the loaf of bread in her hands, as if it was the last thing she had left. He took another step forward, looking straight into her eyes. "If you stay here, you won't survive this season. I'm not asking, and I don't need an explanation. All I need is for you and your daughter to get up and come with me. You'll be safe." The little girl peeked at him, then quickly turned away, holding her mother tighter. The woman remained silent, her eyes carrying both suspicion and a fragile trace of something else. Daniel stepped back, speaking slowly. "I'll get the horse ready. When I come back, I hope you'll both be ready." He turned and walked to the door. As his boots touched the wooden step, through a gap in the rotting wall, he heard the little girl's voice, so soft the wind almost carried it away. "Mom, are they going to make us go back to that house again?" There was no answer, only a heavy silence, like a stone hanging in the air, waiting to fall. Daniel Carter returned to the front of Old Willow Cabin. The sun had climbed higher, its light cutting diagonally through the broken wooden slats and spilling into the corner, where Rachel Morgan stood clutching a small bundle wrapped in a torn blanket. Her tangled hair was tied back at the nape of her neck, revealing cheekbones mottled with bruises that hadn't yet faded. Beside her, Chloe Morgan, a 7-year-old girl with swollen red-rimmed eyes, stood pressed close to her mother, fingers gripping the hem of her shirt. Daniel stopped his horse and stepped toward Chloe. He crouched down, extending his hand. "Come on up, sweetheart." Chloe glanced at the outstretched hand, then looked up at her mother. She hesitated, lips pressed tightly together. Rachel gave a slight nod, her hand resting gently on her daughter's back. Still, Chloe shrank away for a moment before allowing Daniel to lift her. She was light as a feather, but the way she recoiled when he set her down on the wooden seat told Daniel all he needed to know. This child was used to fearing the touch of grown-ups. Rachel climbed up after her, holding the bundle tightly in her lap. Daniel said nothing more, only gathered the reins. The steady rhythm of the horse's hooves echoed on the dirt road, the wheels grinding against gravel with a dry, brittle sound. Chloe sat pressed against her mother, clutching a worn cloth doll. From time to time, her eyes darted toward the saddlebag, where the corner of a small picture frame peeked out inside it. A photograph of Emily Carter, smiling in a white dress. Daniel caught the glance and asked softly, "What's your name?" Chloe tucked her head in and didn't answer. The doll in her arms was held even tighter. Rachel placed a hand on her daughter's head and explained gently, "Her name is Chloe." Daniel nodded and turned his eyes back to the road ahead. He hadn't planned to ask anything more, but a few minutes later, it was Rachel who spoke. "Why are you doing this? I don't even know you." His voice stayed steady, unhurried. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. And I've lived through the same kind of pain when my wife passed away, leaving me and my daughter to get by on our own. That's why I don't want to see anyone else go through that." Rachel stayed silent, her eyes fixed on a faraway point, as if she were trying to swallow something back down. His answer carried no promises, no poetic flourishes, yet it somehow made it harder for her to refuse. The road into Brookfield wound its way through dry fields. The wind carried dust that wrapped around the wagon wheels and slipped in through the gaps in their clothing. The air inside the wagon remained still, but somewhere in that quiet, a thin thread of hope began to weave itself between the three of them. When they were still a short distance from town, Daniel slowed his pace, his eyes instinctively sweeping along the streets. Children darted across the road, and a few men were hauling crates into the Sunny Mart general store. Then, at the corner of the street, Rachel spotted a figure leaning casually against a wooden post. It was Marcus Kane, tall and broad-shouldered. A half-smile played on his lips. His eyes never left the wagon, as if measuring the distance and calculating something. When their eyes met, Marcus tilted his head ever so slightly, just enough for Rachel to understand. He had seen the two of them, and he wasn't going to let it go. Daniel glanced back and caught sight of a man staring straight at their wagon. His grip on the reins tightened when he saw the fear in Rachel's face. He didn't ask her about the man, but he understood whoever he was. He had something to do with these two, and he was not a good man. The horse slowed, the wagon wheels crunching over the gravel with a harsher scrape in the silence. Beside him, Rachel lowered her head to avoid the gaze, while Chloe clutched her rag doll so tightly that her small fingers turned white. Daniel didn't look back again, but he could still feel Marcus Kane's gaze fixed on the back of his neck the entire way. The man didn't shout, didn't follow, he just stood there and smirked. Daniel knew men like Marcus all too well. Silence didn't mean letting go. It meant waiting for the right moment. He urged the horse to go faster. Chloe shrank into her mother's arms, while Rachel kept her head down, clutching the thin bundle in her lap as if it held both their lives inside. When the wagon wheels rolled into the yard of Willow Creek Ranch, the large wooden door of the main house swung open. The housekeeper, Margaret Maggie Thompson, a sturdy woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned in a neat bun, stepped out. She wore an apron dusted with a bit of cornmeal, likely having just put a batch of cornbread into the oven. Her eyes narrowed slightly when she saw Daniel wasn't returning alone. "Daniel, who is this?" Her voice was low, slow, but without tension. "They're my guests," he answered briefly, stepping down and reaching up to help Chloe. Maggie glanced quickly over the mother and daughter, taking in the worn clothes and the bruises still visible on Rachel's wrist. Instead of asking questions, she simply gave a small nod and said, "Come in, I'll get a meal started right away." Rachel hesitated at the threshold, her eyes searching deep into the house as though stepping inside might come with a price. Chloe kept her small hand wrapped tightly around her mother's. Maggie led them into the dining room. The warm aroma of simmering beans and fresh cornbread filled the air. The soft clink of a spoon against a pot, the gentle crackle of firewood in the brick stove, everything combined to make the space feel unusually safe. Rachel and Chloe sat down at the long table. A few minutes later, Daniel returned with Emily, just home from school, her hair tousled by the wind. The girl stopped short when she saw Chloe, then offered a gentle smile and took a seat across from her. Dinner began. Rachel ate slowly, as if weighing every bite. Chloe stared at the steaming bowl of beans in front of her, her eyes lighting up but her hand too hesitant to reach for the spoon. Quietly, Emily slid her slice of sweet bread across the table toward Chloe. "Go ahead," Emily said softly, her voice light as a breeze. Chloe glanced at her mother. Rachel gave a small nod. Only then did the little girl pick up the bread, take a tiny bite, and quickly set it down again as if afraid someone might take it away. Midway through the meal, Rachel spoke, her voice so low only Daniel could hear. "I've never been in a room like this without having to pay for it." He set his spoon down, meeting her gaze. "Rest. No one here will take anything from you." Maggie Thompson turned back and set another bowl of hot soup in front of Chloe, offering a warm, gentle smile. She didn't ask about the past, nor did she press in with pity, something Daniel knew Rachel needed more than anything else right now. When they finished eating, Maggie led them to a small room at the end of the hallway. The bed was already made with clean sheets, and on top lay a thick blanket that still held a trace of warmth from drying in the morning sun. A wooden table sat beside the window, with a basin of water and neatly folded towels on top. Chloe placed her hand on the blanket, pressed down lightly, and then, without meaning to, smiled the first smile Daniel had seen from her since they met. "Sleep here, sweetheart," Maggie said, her voice carrying the steady assurance of someone well accustomed to protecting others. Rachel nodded in thanks. When the door closed, she leaned her back against it, her eyes blurring. Chloe sat on the bed, turning her cloth doll in her hands, for the first time not clutching it like a shield. Out in the yard, Daniel still hadn't come inside. He stood leaning against the fence, his gaze fixed on the direction of Brookfield. His hand tightened around the reins hanging from the post, his fingers giving a slight twitch every so often. In his mind, Marcus Kane's face was vivid, along with that faint, cold smile. Daniel knew the steps he'd taken today had caught Marcus's attention, and it wouldn't be long before trouble made its way to Willow Creek Ranch. The next morning, the sun had just risen, but the air at Willow Creek Ranch was already bustling. The sound of roosters crowing echoed from the backyard, one after another, and the smell of fresh cornbread that Maggie Thompson had just taken out of the oven drifted through every room. Daniel Carter had been up since early, making a full round to check the northern fence line before coming back to find Rachel Morgan. "Do you need to pick up anything in town?" he asked when he saw her hanging a few hand-washed clothes on the line. Rachel paused for a moment, as if weighing her answer. "I do, but I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," he said shortly. "Get ready, we'll head out before the market gets crowded." Chloe was left at the house with Emily and Maggie. Daniel told his daughter, "Play with Chloe and keep an eye on her for me, okay?" Emily nodded, her eyes bright with excitement at being given a job. The road into Brookfield was the same as always, old cobblestone, lined on both sides with yellow-painted houses and dark wooden doors. Daniel led the horse into the main market square, where the calls of vendors and the chatter of bargaining mixed into a kind of noisy rhythm unique to the place. Rachel walked slowly, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings as if checking whether someone she knew might be nearby. The slanting morning sun cast a pale golden light across her face, but the faint traces of bruises still lingered beneath her skin. Daniel walked beside her, one hand holding the reins, his eyes sweeping in every direction. As they turned into the narrow aisle between the fabric stalls, a sharp female voice cut through the air like the edge of a knife. "Well, well, I thought you'd vanished. Guess you found yourself a new shoulder to lean on after all." The speaker was Linda Harris, a woman in her 40s, wearing a striking red dress and heavy lipstick, her gaze a mix of curiosity and sarcasm. Linda was Rachel's sister-in-law, the wife of Marcus Kane's older brother, and she was well known around town for her inability to keep her mouth shut and her habit of treating other people's business as her favorite pastime. Rachel froze, her lips pressing tightly together. She didn't answer, just moved as if to walk on. But Linda stepped forward, her voice deliberately loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your new man?" Daniel stepped forward half a pace, placing himself between the two women. He looked at Linda, his voice low but firm. "We've got things to do. Step aside." The look in his eyes made Linda hesitate for just a moment, but before turning away, she still managed to throw out a parting remark. "Careful. Women like her never stay put." Inside the Sunny Mart general store, the air was cooler thanks to the thick walls and the slow-turning ceiling fan. The store's owner, Ed Coleman, greeted Daniel with a familiar nod. Rachel stood at the counter, holding a slip of paper with her shopping list. She looked a little unsure as she searched for the right shelves, her eyes shifting between bags of rice, sacks of sugar, and jars of spices. Daniel stayed close, not interfering, but near enough for her to feel his presence. From time to time, he quietly slipped a few extra items into the basket: a roll of red ribbon, a box of colored pencils, a small bag of candy. When Rachel glanced at him with a questioning look, he simply said, "These are for Chloe." And for Emily. They paid for the groceries while Ed wrapped up the goods, making small talk that didn't touch on anything too personal. He didn't ask questions, just remarked, "Town's been buzzing lately. Heard Marcus has been hanging around that tavern out on the south edge." Daniel answered only with a quiet, "Yeah," revealing nothing more. When they stepped out of the store, the glare of the midday sun washed over their eyes. Daniel set the bags down on the wagon and turned to tell Rachel to climb in first, then his eyes stopped cold. Just a few steps away, leaning against the wooden post of a porch, Marcus Kane stood with his arms crossed. The wide-brimmed hat shaded half his face, but that crooked smirk was unmistakable. He was tall, his posture so casual that a passerby might think he was just taking a break. But his eyes told a different story. They were locked on Rachel, sharp enough to cut right through her. Daniel felt Rachel stiffen beside him. Her breathing caught. Marcus tilted his head and spoke in a low, steady tone, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "How long do you think you can keep running, Rachel?" Daniel took a full step forward, blocking half her body from view, his gaze never leaving the other man's. In the noisy hum of the marketplace, the few yards between them seemed to tighten, heavy and unbroken. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay on her side, eyes open in the darkness, the words Marcus had thrown at her in the market looping over and over. "How much longer can you keep running?" Chloe shifted in her sleep, burrowing deeper into her mother's chest, her small arms clinging tightly as if afraid someone might pull her away. Rachel stroked her daughter's hair and whispered softly, "I'm here." But her hand still trembled, memories of nights locked in and the cold click of a turning key flooding back like a heavy, damp tide. Near dawn, she drifted into a fitful sleep, her mind still replaying the front steps of the old house and the shadowed figure of the man who always stood blocking the door. Before the first light of morning, Daniel was already awake. He went out to the stables to check the saddles and tack, then stopped by the kitchen to greet Maggie. She was pouring coffee and spoke quietly. "Ed sent word there's trouble at the market." Marcus brought along his two cousins. Daniel only nodded, took the coffee mug, and listened to the sound of Emily's footsteps running down the hallway and Chloe's soft giggles from the porch. Looking out the window, he saw Rachel hanging a few pieces of laundry, her movements slow but steady, her shoulders flinching slightly whenever a breeze passed. "Stay here with the girls," Daniel said as he approached, his tone calm. "I'm going to the market for a bit. I'll be back soon." Rachel looked up. "Is something wrong?" "Just a rumor," he replied. "I'm going to make sure." By late morning, the market in Brookfield was packed. Daniel tied his horse at the edge and walked straight into the main aisle between the stalls. It wasn't long before the swish of coats brushing together and the thud of boots on the stone pavement made him stop. Marcus Kane stepped out from the shade of a doorway, followed by two younger men with hard faces and restless eyes, Ethan Kane and Ryan Kane, his cousins, both known for picking fights after they'd had too much to drink. "Out early today, Mr. Carter," Marcus said, his crooked smile fixed in place. "I'm looking for my wife. Have you seen her?" Daniel stood tall, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "She's not here." "Then where is she?" Marcus tilted his head, his voice rising. "You took her away now, give her back. This is a family matter." Ethan spat on the ground near Daniel's boots and jerked his chin up. "Don't make us come out to your ranch." Ryan let out a low, mean chuckle, as if the conversation was already over and they just needed to go fetch her. Daniel didn't move, his voice dropping a notch. "You know your way home. You walk away this time next time. It won't be that easy." Marcus snorted, but before he could take another step, a police officer appeared from the right. Officer James Walker, a middle-aged man wearing a municipal badge, walked toward them slowly, with the tired expression of someone used to watching things play out without intervening. He glanced over at the three members of the Kane family, then at Daniel. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Marcus smirked. "Family business. No need for the police." Ethan and Ryan shifted a little, making it look as if they were just standing around chatting. Daniel said clearly, "They threatened to come to my home." Walker shrugged, his tone deliberately non-committal. "I just see three men talking. If there's a fight, call me." With that, he turned away, walking off at an unhurried pace without looking back. The crowd nearby began to murmur. Some people avoided Marcus's eyes and hurried away. Others looked at Daniel as if they wanted to say something but thought better of it. Amid the clamor of the market, the silence of the law felt louder still. Marcus leaned casually against a post and winked at his two cousins. "You heard him," he said in a low voice meant for Daniel's ears alone. "No one's getting involved in my family business. This afternoon I'm coming for Rachel and the little girl too." Daniel stepped forward half a pace, planting himself squarely in the way. "You're not coming through my gate." "Gate locked?" Ryan chuckled. "If not, I'll knock." Ethan folded his arms and tipped his head back. "Don't make this harder. A man's wife, he comes to get her." Daniel didn't answer. He held Marcus's gaze long enough for that smirk to falter for just a fraction of a second. Then he turned and walked away from the market. Behind him, Marcus's voice carried, light but edged. "Tell Rachel to dress nice. I don't like freeloaders." The two cousins' coarse laughter followed, trailing out like the ringing of a bell. On the way home, Daniel kept his horse at a steady pace. The midday wind was hot and dry, lashing his face like a warning. When he reached the gate of Willow Creek Ranch, he saw Rachel standing on the porch, a clothespin still in her hand. Emily and Chloe sat on the steps below, coloring on a piece of cardboard. "You were back so fast," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is something wrong?" Daniel set the basket down and looked her straight in the eye. Marcus brought his two cousins to the market. They threatened to come here. Rachel's hand tightened around the clothespin, her knuckles turning white. She swallowed hard, her gaze drifting away. "I'm sorry. I brought this trouble to your home." "I already told you," Daniel replied slowly, each word deliberate. "This is my home. I'm responsible for protecting the people inside it." Rachel opened her mouth, but only managed half a breath. She gave a small nod, stepped back, and placed the clothespin in the basket. Her face looked thinner from worry, but at the corner of her eyes there was the faintest light, fighting against the fear. That afternoon, Daniel brought Emily and Chloe inside, telling both girls not to go near the gate without an adult. Maggie gathered some of the items from the porch, her tone firm yet warm as she said, "You two play in the kitchen. It's cool and safe there." Then she handed Daniel a coil of wire and a sack of nails. "Will this be enough?" "Enough," he said, taking them and nodding. As the sun began to tilt west, the sound of hammering rang out from the north side of Willow Creek Ranch. Daniel set each wooden post, sharpening the tops, pulling the wire tight, and twisting each knot as if binding a promise. Sweat ran down his back, soaking into his shirt, but his hands never slowed. Each strike of the hammer was an unspoken sentence. "No one comes in here while I'm still standing." From the kitchen doorway, Rachel watched. She didn't walk over, just kept her eyes on him, her hands resting on the hem of her apron. The steady rhythm of the hammer seemed to calm her breathing. Inside, Emily and Chloe sat close together, whispering about the red ribbon and the shiny tin whistle. When the north fence was nearly finished, a black crow landed on the tip of a freshly sharpened post. It tilted its head, staring toward the town, its small eyes like two pieces of coal catching the sun. Daniel looked up, instinctively tightening his grip on the hammer's handle. The wind passed through, making the wire hum faintly like an over-tightened guitar string. He drove in one more nail, deep and solid. But the feeling of someone watching from a distance refused to leave. Early in the morning, the sound of a hammer striking wooden posts echoed steadily, like the heartbeat of the house. Daniel Carter was rebuilding the north fence, measuring the spacing, sharpening each post to a point, tightening the wire until the faint vibration disappeared. Sweat soaked through the back of his shirt, but his hands never slowed. Each swing of the hammer was a reminder. Someone here needed to be kept safe. Rachel Morgan stood on the porch, her hands folded at the front of her apron. She watched without asking anything. Inside her chest was a strange feeling, as if a door that had been shut for years had quietly opened a small crack. Chloe Morgan sat on the steps, leaning her shoulder against Emily Carter, whispering and giggling when the crayon slid off the edge of the paper. As the sun rose higher, Daniel stepped onto the porch and washed his hands in the basin. Maggie Thompson brought out 2 glasses of fresh agua fresca and set them on the wooden table. She looked at the new fence and gave a short nod. That was all. No flowery compliments, but everyone understood. The days that followed passed slowly, as if even time wanted to soften its tone. Rachel began tidying the kitchen, washing shirts, and hanging clothes to dry. Occasionally, she would leave a chore unfinished just to see if everything would fall apart the way it used to. Every time she returned, she noticed some small difference. The egg basket was full. Someone had gathered them from the chicken coop. The frayed cuff of a sleeve had been neatly mended. Chloe's old shoes had been cleaned, with new laces placed beside them. Rachel touched the tip of her finger to the toe of her daughter's shoe. It felt like touching something very real, very small, but warm enough to carry her through the day without trembling. At noon, Emily pulled Chloe into the kitchen to practice counting beans. The two girls miscounted, burst out laughing, and started over from 1. Maggie stood nearby, reminding them just enough. It doesn't have to be fast, just correct. Rachel saw her daughter's back a little straighter, her shoulders no longer shrinking whenever she heard an adult's footsteps pass by. That afternoon, when the sun had lost some of its glare, Rachel went into the kitchen to look for the water jug. On the table lay a freshly baked loaf of bread resting on a white cloth. The golden crust was split with small cracks, like the grain of wood. It still gave off a gentle warmth, and the smell of flour mingled with the scent of the wood stove made her throat tighten. A memory surfaced, her mother's hands, years ago, setting a loaf just like this in the center of the table, telling her, "Eat before it gets cold." Before everything had changed, Rachel stood there for a long time without touching it. At last, she took a knife and sliced a thin piece. The crust crackled softly. She placed the first piece into Chloe's hands, the next for Emily, and only then took a bite for herself. The crumb was soft, lightly sweet. No mold, no sourness, just bread, ordinary and whole. Daniel walked past the kitchen doorway, stopping when he saw the three of them quietly chewing. He didn't ask anything. He simply set a small wooden picture frame he had just made on the table. The frame was empty, without a photo. "Put in whatever you want," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Chloe, who was holding her piece of bread with both hands as if afraid to drop it. As the afternoon cooled, Daniel carried a chair out to the porch and sat down, sharpening his wire-cutting knife. Rachel followed a moment later, sitting 2 steps away from him. The two girls ran in circles around the yard, competing to tie a red ribbon into each other's braids. Their laughter rose into the air, blending with the sound of crickets. "You didn't have to bring us here," Rachel began, her voice steady, without a tremor. She didn't look at him, her eyes following the ribbon fluttering in her daughter's hair. "Maybe not," Daniel replied, still running the blade along the sharpening stone in even strokes. "But I couldn't leave you there." The words landed on the wooden step, whole and solid, heavy enough but not crushing. There was no pity in them, no plea for recognition, just the truth, able to stand on its own. Rachel swallowed slowly. In her chest, it felt like a door had opened a little wider. "Here." She drew in a breath, searching for the words. "No one asks me what I have to pay." "Here," Daniel said, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "We do what we can for each other. That's enough." A moment later, Maggie stepped onto the porch. She placed a bundle of nails, still warm from the sun, into Daniel's hand. "The last section of the fence will be done tomorrow." Then she turned to Rachel and spoke softly. "The night's turning cooler. Put an extra blanket on the little one." Rachel nodded. She carried the blanket into the bedroom and folded it neatly at the foot of the bed. Chloe was already tired, her head resting on Emily's shoulder, crumbs still clinging to her lips. Rachel wiped her daughter's mouth, pulled the blanket up to her chest, and lingered a moment over the faint scar on her own wrist. She rubbed it gently, not to erase it, but to remind herself it no longer held power over her. When the house had quieted, Rachel stepped onto the porch again. Daniel was still there, leaning back against a post, looking north. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'm adding 2 more lines of wire along the low ground. People moving fast tend to slip there. You think they'll come?" "I don't guess," he said. "I prepare." She pressed her lips together, then gave a small nod. "What can I do?" "Tomorrow, don't hang laundry outside the gate. Keep the kids in the kitchen. And if you hear horses, lock the door and wait for me to call you." Rachel sat there a while longer. Neither of them spoke. When she finally stood, she turned to thank him. But Daniel had already pulled the knife from its sheath and pressed the tip lightly into the wood rail, testing its edge. Then he resumed sharpening it. The sound was small and steady, like an underground stream. Night settled in. Inside the house, the faint snoring of the children drifted down the hallway. Maggie turned off most of the lights, leaving one on in the kitchen. Rachel drew the curtain and took one last look at the yard. Beyond the ranch gate, in the thickest patch of shadow, A man on horseback had stopped. The wide brim of his hat hid half his face. He sat motionless, as if only there to listen. After a moment, he turned his horse and slowly rode back toward town. A northern wind picked up, slipping through the freshly strung wire and making it hum ever so faintly. The morning air was still cool when Maggie Thompson knocked lightly on the office door. She handed Daniel Carter a sheet of paper folded in quarters. On it were several names, written in careful cursive. "These people said they're willing to testify for Rachel," she told him. "I asked them last night." Daniel glanced at the paper and gave a small nod. "We're going to need them." He called two old friends, Tom Green and Julian Price. Tom owned a small farm out near Riverside, a steady, mild-mannered man well known at the local market. Julian was a blacksmith, broad-shouldered, quiet, but a man of his word. Both had stood beside Daniel through hard years, so when he asked, they were ready to go without hesitation. The three men started at the clinic near the town square. Dr. Richard Hayes, an older man with thin-framed glasses, opened his ledger, listened to Daniel explain, and then said plainly, "If this is for the safety of her and her child, I'll put in writing exactly what I've seen." He examined the old wounds that had already healed and the newer bruises that were beginning to fade. He wrote out a medical statement, briefly describing the extent of both the emotional and physical harm, signed it, and stamped it. "If necessary, I'll stand up in church and say it in front of everyone," he added, his voice steady as a promise. Leaving the clinic, they headed down the narrow lane behind Maple Street, where Rachel had once lived. Irene Clark, an elderly neighbor, opened the door when she heard the knock. She glanced over Daniel's shoulder as if worried someone might overhear, then invited them inside. "I heard more than a few arguments," she said, eyes lowered to the dish towel twisting in her hands. "Every night, it seemed. Some nights, even late, I'd still hear the sound of a lock turning. In the morning, she'd be out hanging laundry with her hands shaking and her face bruised." Tom wrote down each detail, noting the specific dates Irene could recall. 2 houses down, Matt Brooks, the local delivery driver, confirmed more. "I saw her bedroom door padlocked from the outside. Not once, but more than once." He wrote his statement in large, straight letters and signed it with a sharp stroke, as if closing the door on the memory of what he'd witnessed. At the Sunny Mart General Store, Ed Coleman gave Daniel a brief look before waving him behind the counter. He pulled out an old ledger, its leather cover worn. "This is the neighborhood fund book," he said. "Marcus once withdrew a sum for community well repairs, but the well hasn't been touched to this day." Julian flipped to the page with Marcus's signature. Ed reached into the drawer for a photocopy of the withdrawal slip and lowered his voice. "I kept this from back then, just in case." He handed the paper to Daniel. "I'll speak up in church if needed. We can't let that money vanish as if it never existed." Resting in the shade of the store's front porch, Daniel reviewed the documents. The medical statement, the 2 neighbor affidavits, the fund withdrawal slip. They weren't sledgehammers, but together they formed a strong enough staff to hold the door of justice open. He looked at Tom and said quietly, "This afternoon, go see Officer James Walker. If he still tries to brush this off, at least get his signature showing he's received the information." Tom nodded, removed his hat, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and mounted his horse, riding off right away. As the afternoon faded, Daniel Carter returned to Willow Creek Ranch. Emily and Chloe were sitting on the porch steps, each holding a brand new notebook. Maggie Thompson caught a glimpse of the thick stack of papers in his hand, gave a brief nod as if she already understood, and didn't ask a thing. Daniel went looking for Rachel in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her movements slower but steadier than before. "I need you to know about this," he said, setting the stack of documents on the wooden table. "Tomorrow, I'm taking these to Father Michael and the police. Then I'm asking the townspeople to hear it all at the church." Rachel dried her hands, looking through the pages one by one. Her eyes stopped on Dr. Richard Hayes's red seal, then on Irene Clark's signature. "They actually signed their names. They've seen it all," Daniel said. "And they're tired of pretending they haven't." Rachel stayed quiet for a moment, then let out a slow breath, as if shedding part of the weight she'd been carrying. She pulled out a chair and sat down, her fingers lacing together. "I need to say this." Daniel sat across from her, keeping just enough distance. "My husband's family used to threaten me," Rachel said evenly, her voice low. "If I ran away, they'd fight for custody of Chloe. They told me I was unstable, unfit to care for her." Daniel met her eyes without hesitation. "If they show up here, I'll be the one standing at the door." Rachel blinked. "I've heard that line more times than I can count," she said, the corners of her mouth trembling slightly. "But this time, I believe it." Out on the porch, the two girls' laughter rang out after they botched a counting game. Maggie set 2 mugs of hot cocoa on the table, meeting Daniel's eyes for just a second, her way of telling him to keep his pace steady. He gave a small nod, picked up 1 mug, and slid it toward Rachel. She cupped it in both hands, holding it close to her chest, the heat seeping in and chasing away the last of the chill in her bones. By early evening, Julian Price returned. He tied up his horse in the yard and came straight into the kitchen, his voice low. "Got word from the Silver Star Tavern. The boy who runs errands there, name's Tyler Reed, says Marcus Kane left town 2 days ago. But he'll be back by the weekend." Daniel asked simply, "Alone? Number?" "He said he's bringing a few guys to straighten things out." Julian set his hat on the table, his expression tightening. "We probably don't have much time." Daniel gathered all the documents into a hard folder and tied it shut. He stood, looking out into the dark yard where the newly strung fence wires caught the kitchen light like a thin silver line. "Tomorrow," he said, "we put all of this out in the open, and we get ready for the weekend." The night breeze lifted the edge of the curtain. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of horses carried for a moment, then faded away, swallowed by the dark. Inside the house, 4 people, young and old, sat around the table, each keeping their own silence. Yet in the spaces between those silences, something was binding them tighter than any spoken vow. That afternoon, the bells of St. Michael's Church rang 3 short chimes. The churchyard was packed. People spoke in low voices, glancing at each other without daring to guess what might happen next. Inside, every long wooden pew was filled. Father Michael Andrews, a slender, middle-aged priest with a deep voice and a reputation for calm, stood near the wooden lectern, nodding a greeting to each person who came in. The air was heavy, like the sky before a storm. Rachel Morgan sat in the last row, her hand gripping Chloe's tightly. She kept her head down, avoiding curious stares. Margaret Maggie Thompson sat 1 seat over, her strong, work-worn hand resting lightly on Chloe's back in quiet reassurance. Up front, Daniel Carter held a cardboard portfolio of documents, standing close to Thomas Tom Green and Julian Price. On the lectern, Edward Ed Coleman had placed the Neighborhood Association's ledger, while Dr. Richard Hayes held a sealed envelope stamped with the clinic's seal. Father Michael gave a signal, and the murmuring subsided. "We are gathered here today," he said clearly, "to listen and decide what must be done before God and before each other." Daniel stepped up half a step and opened the portfolio. He laid out on the table the medical certification from Dr. Hayes, 2 written statements from Irene Clark and Matthew Matt Brooks, and a photocopy of a fund withdrawal slip signed by Marcus Kane. "I won't tell a long story," he said in an even tone. "These are facts, not rumors." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, removing his glasses. "I examined Miss Morgan. There are both old and recent injuries consistent with prolonged abuse. I will sign as a witness if needed." From the middle rows, Irene Clark rose to her feet, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I've heard the sound of locks turning at night. I've seen her hanging laundry with bruised arms. I signed my name to that statement." Matt Brooks spoke next. "I've seen her bedroom door locked from the outside more than once." Ed Coleman opened the ledger, holding it up for all to see. "This page records community well repairs. The money was withdrawn. The well was never touched. I have a photocopy of the withdrawal slip. The signature, Marcus Kane." A wave of murmurs rose, then swelled into open outrage. Someone muttered, "Shameless." Another answered, "Enough." The church doors swung open hard. Marcus Kane walked in, hat pulled low, followed by Ethan and Ryan Kane. He didn't look at the priest or the cross. His eyes went straight to the back of the church where Rachel sat. "You trying to humiliate me?" he barked, stomping down the center aisle. Julian stepped in to block him, his shoulders like a wall. Daniel didn't move, his eyes still fixed on the lectern. Father Michael raised his hand. "This church is not a place for threats." Marcus Kane lifted his chin and gave a thin smile. "I'm here to take my wife and my daughter. This is my family's business, and I'll handle it myself." From the right side, Linda Harris shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "Don't disgrace your own family in front of the whole town. She left her husband, lived off others, and now she's making up stories." A woman in the front pew turned around. She was about 45, her hair neatly braided, wrapped in a dark blue shawl. Patricia Long, the neighborhood's assistant treasurer, normally reserved, spoke with a steady voice. "Linda, sit down." Linda froze for a beat. "Excuse me?" Patricia stepped forward, facing the crowd. "You were the one who helped Marcus take money from the community fund. You signed off on the item listed as cement purchase. Where's the cement? I have the internal records. And you also took a cut for your so-called management fee." The air exploded. People shot up from their seats. Edward Coleman slapped his hand on the ledger. "That's right. Your name is right here." Linda's face drained of color, and she stammered. Marcus growled, "Shut your mouth. That was an arrangement." Daniel Carter lifted the folder of papers, his voice not loud but cutting. "There are no arrangements anymore. What we have here is the truth and the law." Officer James Walker and 2 younger officers had already been standing at the doorway. He scanned the gathered community, hesitated briefly, then walked straight to the front. "Let me see the documents," James said. Daniel handed them over. James skimmed through, checking the seal and signatures. His eyes swept over the angry crowd, then up to the cross above the altar. The familiar hesitation was gone. He turned back and gave a short order. "Cuff them." Ethan Kane lunged forward, but Julian Price blocked him with a cold stare. Ryan Kane stepped back half a pace. Marcus started to resist, but the murmurs of "arrest them" and "enough" swelled beneath the vaulted ceiling. 2 officers moved in, twisted Marcus's arms behind his back, and locked the cuffs. Another officer stepped toward Linda Harris, reading her the warrant for detention on charges of embezzlement. Linda's body went limp. She kept protesting her innocence, but her voice broke. James looked toward the back of the church. "Miss Morgan, would you like to say anything?" Rachel Morgan rose to her feet. Her hand was still holding Chloe's. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp and clear. "I don't want anyone to be afraid when they hear the sound of a lock turning ever again." The church held its breath for 1 heartbeat. Then someone clapped. Then a second, a third. The applause rolled together into a single wave. Father Michael folded his hands. "We have chosen to stand on the side of the light. The rest, we will let the law finish." He turned to Daniel, giving a brief nod. Daniel returned it, then glanced to the back. Rachel was holding Chloe closer, and Margaret Thompson touched her shoulder as if to say, "It's over." The officers led the 2 prisoners toward the door. Ethan and Ryan Kane kept their heads down, no longer smirking. The crowd parted to make way. Just as they reached the threshold, Marcus looked back. Sunlight slanted across his face, sharpening his smile into something cold and razor-thin. He locked eyes with Daniel and spoke softly enough for only them to hear, yet close enough that those nearby felt a chill. "This isn't over." He was shoved forward. The church doors closed behind them, the creak of the old hinges stretching out like the shadow of his words across the stone floor. In the last pew, Chloe buried her face into her mother's shoulder and let out a breath of relief. Daniel tightened his grip on the folder, looked up at the cross for a brief moment, then lowered his gaze, calmly planning his next move. The morning after the meeting at St. Michael's Church, there was a visitor in the yard of Willow Creek Ranch. A woman in a light blue jacket wearing a plastic name badge stepped down from a hired carriage. "I'm Amanda Foster, the coordinator for community assistance cases." She introduced herself, her voice gentle but firm. "The fund has approved emergency aid for Rachel Morgan and young Chloe, a small amount of cash, vouchers for essential items, and, if needed, a small rental room on Jefferson Street." Maggie Thompson invited her into the kitchen and poured her a glass of water. Rachel sat across from her, fingers intertwined. Chloe leaned against her mother's shoulder. Daniel Carter stood leaning against the doorframe, listening. Amanda opened a canvas bag and placed on the table a neatly folded bundle of clothes, several store vouchers, and a sealed envelope. "We'll take care of the paperwork," she said. "If you move into town, you and your daughter will be closer to the school and the clinic." Rachel offered a quiet thank you. It was a small word, but her eyes drifted toward the window, to the new fence standing in straight lines outside. Thin strands of wire, delicate but strong. Her gaze then returned to the porch, where Emily was tying a red ribbon into Chloe's hair, both girls giggling. By noon, Ed Coleman stopped by to deliver some dry goods from the fund. He set a sack of cornmeal on the floor, tilted his head, and asked quietly, "All good, Daniel?" "All good," Daniel answered shortly, grateful for the presence of people who didn't make noise but stood firm. That afternoon, Amanda took Rachel to see the room on Jefferson Street. It was clean, with a south-facing window and a wooden bed already made. Downstairs, in the shared kitchen, there was a small oil stove. The landlord, Howie Bennett, an older man known for being strict but fair, stated plainly, "The rent's cheap, paid on time, no bringing strangers in." Rachel nodded, taking it all in without giving an answer right away. When they stepped outside, she lingered on the porch a moment longer than needed. Amanda, noting the hesitation on her face, said softly, "It's your choice. No one's forcing you." "I know." Rachel tightened her grip on the bag strap, her eyes once again drawn toward the place she already knew well, the image in her mind of the children running under the trees at Willow Creek Ranch. By late afternoon, they were back at the ranch. Emily and Chloe ran to greet them, each holding a piece of candy Maggie had just handed out. Chloe chattered excitedly. "Mom, I finished drawing the butterfly," Emily added proudly. "I taught her to count to 20. The way Chloe spoke in a rush made Rachel pause at the porch, pressing her lips together to hold back a smile that wanted to spill too quickly. Daniel was waiting, one hand resting on the porch post. As Rachel approached, he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "Not because you need to, but because I want you to stay here." Rachel lifted her head slightly. He didn't look away. "We both know," Daniel continued, "a home isn't just walls and a roof. Here, I can stand at the door when the storm comes. If you choose to stay, I'll do that every single day." Rachel stayed silent. The offer carried no strings, no flowery promises. It stood firm on the simplicity and consistency of the man who made it. She swallowed the old fears, letting them settle quietly at the bottom of her chest before she exhaled slowly. By the end of the afternoon, Amanda said goodbye to everyone, promising to return the next day to collect signatures if Rachel chose the rental option. Before stepping up into the carriage, she looked at Rachel and said, as if reminding her, "You have the right to say no. That right is yours." Rachel nodded, a very faint smile on her lips. "Thank you." The sun was setting, flooding the yard with golden light. Emily and Chloe played tag around the water trough, their laughter wrapping around each other, stretching out like a red ribbon in the breeze. Maggie had a fresh pot of beans on the stove. She set the lid in place, then sat down beside Rachel. She wiped her hands with a towel and, in a low voice, said, "A good home isn't just because it keeps out the rain," she said. "It's because there's someone willing to stand at the door when the storm comes." Rachel tilted her head, as if hearing a prayer she had always known but only now understood. "You think I should stay?" "I think you should choose what makes your heart feel at peace." Maggie touched the back of Rachel's hand lightly. "And as for standing at the door, someone has already said they would." Dinner was served out on the porch, cornbread, beans, and a bit of queso fresco. Daniel poured water for the children, then carefully split a small tin whistle in half to replace a loose string, his movements slow and deliberate, without clumsiness. Chloe looked up, as if memorizing every motion of those hands. When they finished eating, Rachel stood and pushed her chair back into place. She looked around the space. In the kitchen, the sound of a spoon tapping a pot. In the small room, a blanket folded neatly. Outside, the fence standing straight, like the words, "I'll stand at the door," written in wood and steel. She exhaled, this time without trembling. "I'll stay," Rachel said, her voice steady. "Not because I can't leave, but because I want to stay." Daniel simply nodded. "All right." Maggie smiled and nodded, like someone who had just seen a seed sprout in the right row of soil. Emily let out a short cheer and turned to hug Chloe. The two girls ran around the yard, calling each other's names as if calling out a brand new life. Night fell. Everyone gathered to wash dishes and clear the table. Daniel turned off most of the lights, leaving only the oil lamp glowing on the porch. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth and the warm aroma of cooked beans. Just then, the old ranch dog gave a low growl. Daniel lifted his head. Far out by the wooden gate, the shadow of someone flickered and then vanished. He stepped quickly outside, unlatched the gate, and looked down the dark road. There was no one, only dust hanging in the air, not yet settled. On the gate latch, a plain envelope was tucked beneath a strand of wire. The paper was rough, the edges jagged, as if torn in haste. Daniel pulled it free and held it under the porch light. Inside was a short note, the handwriting scrawled, the ink smudged at the edge. "We will meet again." He tightened his grip on the note, his fingers pausing for a second before loosening. When he turned back inside, Rachel was already standing on the porch, her eyes asking without words. Daniel set the envelope on the table, covering the writing with the palm of his hand. Tomorrow we'll add more locks to the gate, he said slowly. And at first light, I'll go to St. Michael's Church to see Father Michael. The oil lamp crackled softly. In the corner of the room, Emily and Chloe had fallen asleep, their heads resting against each other, their breathing steady. Outside, the newly built fence made no sound, but everyone could feel the warning it carried, quietly pulled taut in the night. It was a March morning. The early mist, thin as a damp cloth, draped over the pasture. By noon, the sun had warmed just enough for tender green shoots to open their eyes. Emily and Chloe left their shoes on the porch, running barefoot across the warm grass, chasing each other around the water trough, their laughter carrying far, as if calling the birds back into the yard. Daniel carried a box of nails and a wood planer along the horse stalls, replacing a rotted beam and tightening the hinges on a door. He wasn't in a hurry, and he didn't check the time. Every motion was steady, like the rhythm he kept for this home. At the clothesline, Rachel wrung the water out of a child's shirt, shook it twice, and clipped it to the line. She rose on her toes to retie the corner of a bedsheet that was flapping in the breeze. From the kitchen, Maggie stepped out onto the porch with a tray, fresh cornbread still warm, a pot of cocoa, and 4 enamel mugs with chipped rims. "Eat it while it's hot," she said, setting the tray on the table, her eyes glancing toward the 2 girls to make sure they'd wash their hands first. Emily tugged Chloe to the sink, scrubbing their hands under the water while chattering about the blue butterfly that came out of my drawing. While Daniel tested the stall door, a delivery cart stopped outside the gate. A thin-shouldered man, stooped from years of heavy loads, jumped down and called out loudly, "I'm Robert Miller, bringing the order from the seed store. Got a sack of corn, some beans, and 2 bundles of squash seedlings like you asked." He was the kind of man who delivered to ranches all over the area, quick on his feet, concise with his words, and well acquainted with the roads and the sun. Daniel opened the gate, took the sacks, and lowered them to the ground with Miller. "Thanks," he said. "This year I'm planting a week earlier than usual." Miller glanced around and nodded in approval. "This is good land. Plant early, and if the rains don't turn on you, you'll get a big harvest." He signed the invoice, waved a farewell, and promised to be back on Wednesday with more manure. Once the cart disappeared down the road, Daniel stacked the 2 sacks of corn beside the porch. He wiped his hands on his jeans and turned to Rachel. "I'm tilling the rows behind the barn this afternoon. If you're free, can you help me sow?" "All right," Rachel replied, her eyes on Emily and Chloe, who were sitting cross-legged on the ground, lining up beans in neat rows on a small wooden board. She called out, "Don't spill them. We'll plant them for real in a bit." Chloe looked up and nodded hard, both hands still cupped over her share of seeds as if guarding a treasure. The family sat together on the porch. Maggie poured cocoa, the mugs touching with a soft, clear clink. The cornbread was broken in half and passed around, crumbs falling onto the edge of the wooden table. The talk wandered over the planting schedule, whether to switch to a different variety of squash, whether to add a few rows of peppers. Emily asked, "Do peppers make you cough?" Daniel chuckled. "Peppers make you breathe harder, but only if you get greedy." Rachel looked around, taking in the view slowly. The windows were open, the curtains brushing against each other. The gate had a new latch. The north fence stood straight, the wire lying still like a thread sewn tight across a tear. For the first time in years, her chest didn't tighten at the sound of a knock in the distance. If someone knocked now, she would step outside with everyone else. She wouldn't retreat into the dark corner. Daniel set his cup of cocoa down and leaned his elbow on his knee. "Family isn't always about blood," he said, his eyes steady, voice calm. "Sometimes, it's about the people you choose." Rachel stayed quiet for a moment. Then she answered, "I choose to stay, and I choose to believe." "That's enough," he said. Inside, on the small shelf by the door, the wooden frame Daniel had made some time ago finally had something in it. It wasn't a photograph. It was Chloe's drawing. 4 people standing in front of a gate, the 2 children holding red ribbons, with a fence behind them drawn in firm, deliberate strokes. Rachel had once asked her, "Why did you draw the fence?" Chloe had replied, very seriously, "So we know our house has a gate and a fence, and someone to watch the door." By late afternoon, Daniel was out back with a hand plow. He measured the rows with string, used a spade to open the first furrow, then began pulling. Rachel followed behind, dropping corn seeds into each groove, her fingers pressing lightly, as if setting a small wish into the soil. Maggie came out with a bottle of water, occasionally reminding them, "Don't plant too close, or leave room for the roots to breathe. Emily and Chloe ran around as the inspection team, counting each seed that fell and reminding the adults, "Don't forget this corner." When the last furrow was covered, everyone's hands were dusted with soil. The family stepped back to take it in the neat brown lines running straight out toward the field. Daniel leaned on the hoe and exhaled. Rachel brushed her hands off, feeling the pleasant tingle in her palms from the work, like the relief of finally taking off a heavy coat of armor. That evening, the kitchen was warm. Maggie steamed a few tamales, topped them with a bit of queso, and handed one to each child. Emily broke hers in half and gave a piece to Chloe without being told. Chloe leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, smiling even as her eyes drooped from the long day. Rachel pulled a light blanket over her daughter and patted her back gently. Out on the porch, Daniel checked the latch on the gate, then blew out one of the lamps, leaving the kitchen lamp on. Before going to bed, Rachel opened a cupboard and took out the old envelope with the words, "We will meet again," written on it. She looked at it for a moment, then folded it and placed it under the dish shelf, not to hide it, but to put it where it belonged, in the past. She turned off the bedroom light and listened to the steady breathing of the children in the hallway and the soft footsteps of Daniel passing by. There was no knock at the door, only the sound of the house breathing. Outside, the March wind swept across the yard, carrying the scent of freshly turned earth. Somewhere far away, the church bells rang long and slow, each chime following the last in the calm of the evening. The sound passed over the roof, drifted across the fields, and settled on the porch like an unwritten promise, the closing of an old chapter, and the start of a new season of planting for them. The story came to a close at Willow Creek Ranch, where the strands of wire stretched not just a fence, but also a new boundary between darkness and light. The wrongdoers had been brought to justice before the community, and the good were rewarded with a home, a warm embrace, and the right to live in peace. Daniel Carter made no grand promises. He simply stood at the door when the storm came. It was that quiet steadfastness that saved a mother and her child from the chilling sound of locks turning. And from the moldy loaf of bread of days past to the freshly baked bread of today, we see a journey of restoration, dignity reclaimed, trust sown again. What do you think changed their lives the most? The fence, the evidence, or a simple, warm, straightforward promise? Do you believe justice comes only through the law, or does it begin with the decision each of us makes not to look away? In this story, which moment reached you most deeply? The meal that came with no price, the vow, "I'll stand at the door," or the church bells closing an old chapter? I want to hear from you. How are you feeling today? If you or someone you love is going through something that weighs heavy on the heart, please leave a message or reach out to a safe and trusted place near you. Here, we share stories where the good are rewarded, the bad are held accountable, and every comment you leave is a seed of kindness. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were standing at the door like Daniel Carter? Which detail would you like me to explore more deeply in the next story? If you found meaning in this one, please pass it along to someone who needs a bit of warmth. Thank you for being here.